Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this Mixed Methods webinar series brought to you by MIRA, Mixed Methods International Research Association, as well as International Institute for Qualitative Methodology from the University of Alberta. My name is Yvette, and I am with IIQM. I'll be your facilitator for today. Today's speaker is David L. Morgan. He is a professor emeritus in the Department of Sociology at Portland State University. He is a sociological social psychologist who is widely known for his work on mixed methods, including a book for SAGE, Integrating Qualitative and Quantitative Methods. In addition, he has worked extensively on qualitative methods and especially focus groups, including his books Basic and Advanced Focus Groups and Focus Groups as Qualitative Research, and is co-author of the Focus Group Kit. Most recently, he has published Essentials of Dyadic Interviewing for Routledge and co-edited A New Era in Focus Group Research for Palgrave. David, we're very happy to have you here with us today.
Okay.
Just get your PowerPoint up.
Okay. All right, are we ready to go?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Let's see what happens, because I wanted to start off by looking at where sequential designs fit in with a variety of other possibilities. And so I've called this a set of, I'm going to give you a flow chart that shows you the different possible decisions. And let's see about, there we go. All right. So there's the flow chart as a whole. And in particular, if you look over on the right-hand side that's in red, the top starting point is, do methods collect data at the same time? And here we're looking at methods that within the mixed methods design that operate at a different time. And I'm going to call these sequential priorities. And we'll look at all this in more detail. What I particularly wanted to distinguish it from is methods that operate at the same time. So those are on the left-hand side of the column of the diagram. And so this is all about making choices. So if you choose methods that operate at the same time, then we have a second decision that says, do the methods address the same question? So what about we're going to use the methods at the same time and we're going to address the same question? Then we have this idea of convergent findings. And so what we're hoping in this case typically is that we use two different methods to address the same question, and hopefully they come up with similar results. So you could imagine each method as something like a line that intersects the two of them, they converge. And this is also the source of the older name for this kind of design, triangulation, in the sense that the two lines meet like the peak of a triangle. They converge around the same kind of results. Now, that's one very common definition or design. Let's look at the other one that we've got here under, do methods address the same question? No, they're at the same time, but they address different questions. This is sometimes referred to as complementary coverage. The analogy here is something like pieces in a puzzle so that they fit together and that you've got more overall than you would have if you used either method separately. So these are three possibilities: the convergent findings, complementary coverage, and sequential priorities. Let's look at them just a little bit more. Okay. In particular, under the convergent findings, one way to interpret that would be to ask if the qualitative methods, the findings results equal the findings and results from the quantitative methods. Now, we'll see we're going to be using all caps like capital QUAL, capital QUANT there to mean methods that can stand on their own. We've done a full-scale qualitative study and gotten results from that. We've done a full-scale quantitative study and we have results from that. And we want to see if they converge. And we'll expand this notation a little bit when we look at complementary coverage. And one possibility there is that we might do a full-scale qualitative and a full-scale quantitative, and see how well those two components fit together. A different possibility would be we would have a primarily or dominant quantitative study and then add a piece of qualitative that would cover more than if we just had the quantitative. And you can see that we've also got the same possibility with the predominantly qualitative study that might have a quantitative component in addition. Now, when we look at these same things over under sequential priority, there are four different possibilities there, and some of them use a quantitative priority, in this case with a qualitative input. We could flip that around and have a primarily qualitative study with a quantitative input, and there are two other possibilities here. Now, this is what we're going to spend most of the day looking at, these four possibilities. And the point of this figure here is just to show you that these are not the only possibilities. I think they're very common, and I think they have some distinct advantages. One is they're relatively easy to implement, and number two is that they have a fairly direct integration. We put a qualitative component here that feeds into our larger quantitative study, and it's a very straightforward two-step process. Things can be much more difficult over here on this side of the figure, and I'm not going to go into these designs today, but I want to say that it's relatively easy to master the skills on our sequential priorities, and they're very likely to work. Okay, and so I'm not going to say that they're problem free, but compared to some other designs, they really do have some advantages. Now, what I want to look at is a sort of logical layout of these four designs, and that'll be the next set of slides here. Something went off there. Yvette, are you there? Well, let's try it.
Yep, I'm here. I'm not sure why it shut off though, or why it
Yeah.
but hopefully it comes back.
Coming back. There we are. Okay. Let's look at the next set then. I'm going to call these the sequential priorities, and I'm going to build them up in a 2x2 design. So you remember that there were four of them, and that will make our 2x2 picture here. And I often joke that I'm a sociologist, so I have to have a 2x2 table. Somehow it's part of our profession. Uh, but I think you'll see the logic of this as I fill it in. Okay, so we're going to have a priority, and we can give that priority to either a quantitative or a qualitative piece of the project. And we're going to have sequencing, and we can have a preliminary study that feeds into our top priority, or we can have a follow-up study that comes after our main priority component. So it'll be a two-step process, and we can go from either a preliminary input to our major piece or a follow-up study on our major piece. So let's take a look at these. So if we have a quantitative priority and we feed into it with a preliminary method, that's going to look like this. So now we have our smaller qualitative study feeding into our primary or dominant quantitative study. And the name for this traditionally, or at least over the last decade or so, is an exploratory sequential design. Now, what I'm going to do in the majority of the presentation is take each one of these four and lay it out in some detail, how it works, what its purposes are, etc. But I want to look at them all in relationship to each other in this particular table. So here we have the exploratory sequential. We're literally thinking about one of the strengths of qualitative research as a preliminary input is that it's very useful for exploratory purposes. And then if we're doing a primary quantitative study, how can we benefit from those exploratory strengths that the qualitative input could give? Now, things are different when we move down to the one below that and we use our qualitative as a follow-up. So we've still got a predominantly quantitative project, but now we have the qualitative in the follow-up position, and this historically has been known as an explanatory sequential. Okay, so now we're thinking about what strengths can the qualitative add, and we're saying that one of the things we can explore in qualitative stuff with depth and detail is the kind of why do things work the way they do? How do we get the results that we do? And we can begin to explain some of the reasons behind the quantitative outcomes. So that's the explanatory sequential model. And notice that what we've been looking at so far in this column are the ones with the large quant. Now we'll move over and look at the other two designs that are what we're going to call qualitatively driven. In essence, these are driven by the quantitative study. What are its needs? In this case, the needs are some exploratory input. In this case, the needs of the quantitative study are some explanatory follow-up. What are the kinds of things we'd see if we shift over now to the two qualitatively driven designs? All right, so in the top corner there, we're going to look at preliminary inputs to a qualitative priority, and we have some small quantitative study that contributes to a predominantly qualitative project. And I'm going to call this sampling sequential. And when I say I'm going to call this one does not have a traditional name. On the left-hand side, exploratory and explanatory sequential, those are pretty well established. Over here on the right side, the qualitatively driven mixed methods have not been as well developed as the quantitatively driven side. And so I'm developing some labels for these two designs that are qualitatively driven. These aren't nearly as well as established as explanatory and exploratory, but we'll take a look at the sampling sequential design. Typically, that is the most common use for the quantitative inputs into the qualitative project is some kind of assistance with the sampling. And we'll see how that works in more detail. Okay, now if we come down to the bottom right-hand corner, we've got a predominantly qualitative study followed up by a quantitative component, and I've labeled this operationalizing sequential. So I have to say I'm not exactly satisfied with sampling sequential and operationalizing sequential. They're very good descriptions of what happens in these two designs, but they don't have the kind of nice match of explanatory sequential, exploratory sequential. So I'm going to work on these and eventually see if I can come up with some neat formulations. Right now, though, these are good descriptions of what happens in these two qualitatively driven designs. And in particular, in this one, the quantitative follow-up often says, okay, how can we take the qualitative results that we already have and take them a step further by operationalizing them through the strengths of quantitative research? So in each of these designs, which we'll be looking at one by one in the next section, we're taking a strength of our input or follow-up design and adding it to or bringing it into play in combination with either the results that we're seeking in a preliminary design, how can we contribute to a quantitative study or a qualitative study, or we're looking and saying, how can we bring in some additional strengths to follow up either our quantitative or our qualitative study. Okay, let's go ahead with that and look at the first one of these that I've been laying out, which is the exploratory sequential. Okay, that's just showing us the four possibilities. And here come the exploratory sequential designs. And so again, we have the small QUAL feeding into the predominantly quantitative study. Okay. And this will be the format for each of the four designs. This basic slide here will give a definition of what a preliminary exploratory sequential design is. Then we'll look at the applications for that, the typical kinds of quantitative methods we've been using. and then some possible variations on this design. So here we're saying we use a preliminary qualitative study to create content for our primary quantitative study. And so we want to improve the quantitative study by using the kind of exploratory strengths of qualitative methods that will help create content for, in this case, either a survey or a program intervention. So I'm thinking of, classic surveys here in the sense of having a questionnaire and treating our participants as respondents who answer the questions in the questionnaire. Under interventions, I'm thinking of programs and ways that are essentially experimental. We have a goal and we have a set of treating our participants as literally kinds of clients in our intervention. And we're saying, how can we change their circumstances, improve something about their life through our program intervention? So this is often associated with evaluation, but in this case, we're going to have the input, sometimes known as the not a summative evaluation, but a formative evaluation. For the first stage of research in this project, two-step again, begin with the formative, learn something about the situation, move on to the main program design and delivery in the intervention. Okay, so I'm putting a little more emphasis on that because I think we're all familiar with what survey research is and maybe my language of intervention research, but if you think of it as program design in this case, you'll pretty much have in mind what I'm talking about. So for the surveys, we're going to create questions that have the same meaning for both participants and researchers. As researchers, we have the topics we want to investigate, and as we generate questions for those, we want to be sure those questions are meaningful for the participants. In particular, we want them to have the same meaning to the participants as they do to us. But in order to do that, we often need to listen to the participants themselves and hear how they talk about the topic that we're researching. How can we find things about the way they understand it and language that they use and create good questions that really match up our intentions and then their understanding? Now, often in surveys, we'll already have the questions available from previous work that's, tested them out and make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. I'm thinking here of situations where we really don't have anything we can rely on to that extent. We need our qualitative input to create a good survey. Moving down to the intervention, we want to make sure that the participants' perspectives and preferences are taken into account. And so we need to understand something about how the participants relate to what we want to accomplish in the intervention. How do we make that intervention as effective as possible? Well, we listen to our participants and understand the ways that they deal with the particular issues in their lives that are involved in the intervention. And then we take that into account as we design our intervention. I think it helps to think of the opposite of either of these so that, with the survey, we could just write the questions ourselves and say, all right, let's hope they work. Well, it'd be nice to be more certain that they work, and the same is true with the intervention. And so by hearing the participants' experiences, their perspectives, we can really do a better job of either writing our questions or designing our intervention. Okay, so there are some variations on these, and one is discovery. It sort of asks, what stage are you at in the process of putting together your survey or your intervention? I'll put all three of these up and then discuss them one by one. So besides discovery, we could have development and we could have definition. So let's look at discovery. It explores poorly understood aspects of the project to determine what should be included. In this case, in the surveys, we're not even sure what questions we should be asking. We know the topics we want to research, but we're not that sure how to communicate with the participants, the respondents, about those topics. Same thing with the interventions. We really need to discover how the participants' world works so that we can put together an effective intervention from the start. Okay, so this is like saying that you really need to understand these things in ways that are highly exploratory before you can make any progress. Development means you're coming in at kind of a middle level here. You have the questions in the survey. You know you don't have them written, but you know the kinds of topics that you need to develop as survey questions. And so you select what questions and elements should go into the project. In this case, the selection of the elements means the kinds of questions you should be asking. In the intervention, it means something like the kinds of things you should be doing in order to make what you want to have happen. Okay. And then we can move down to the third level, which is the most refined. Maybe you just need to do definition. You have the survey questions in mind, but you want to make sure that the wording of those survey questions matches up to the way participants think and talk about the topic of the survey. Or in the case of the intervention, you really want to fine tune it so that the components you've already worked out really fit with the way the participants will feel about the things you're doing. How can you maximize that effectiveness by really getting a good fit between the things you know you're going to do in your project and the way the participants feel about it? Okay, so those are three common possibilities for the exploratory sequential design. Now I'll move on to the other quantitatively driven design. Here are examples, and I will go through them just quickly because I think I've laid out the logic of this pretty well. But let's suppose in survey research you want to talk to some breast cancer patients to understand their experience with diagnosis. Okay, so the assumption here is that there isn't good research on this topic. You need to explore the experiences of the breast cancer patients in order to write a good questionnaire. If there's very little been done in this area, then you may want to do a kind of initial discovery oriented process. Alternatively, if you have a pretty good idea what's going on in this area, all the way down to the point where you even know what questions you should ask, but you want to improve on the wording, then you'd be doing a definition kind of study as your preliminary qualitative input. Coming down to the intervention, I said creating a support program for recent widows that maximizes the ability to meet their needs effectively. Okay, so I would say that there are a fair number of support programs already out there for recent widows, but let's say we don't know as much as we might about how they work. And we want to develop a really effective program. And so, in order to do that, let's say we could do case studies on several existing support programs, see how they work as a developmental kind of process, and then from there, really define our particular program that we think would really use those qualitative inputs, the strengths of what we learned through the case studies in order to create our own new maximally effective program. Okay, so there'll be examples for each of these, and that's the set of exploratory sequential examples. Now we have the explanatory sequential designs, and we're going to follow up on our quantitative results. Let's look at the framework slide there. So we're going to follow up. It says qualitative study, excuse me there. We're going to follow up on a quantitative study to understand the results. Okay. And so we're going to use a qualitative study to understand the results from our big Q quantitative study. Okay. And so applications, Now we're going to have applications that could fit surveys or could fit interventions. And on the survey side, we're going to assist in understanding relationships between variables. So when I talk about working with the survey results, well, what are our results from a statistical analysis of a survey? Their relationships between variables. That might be a t-test to see whether two groups differ with regard to their scores on a dependent variable. It might be a correlation to look at relationships between a pair of variables. It might be a set of regression equations or structural equation models, all of which follow the basic pattern of understanding relationships between variables. And now we're going to use our qualitative study to assist in understanding those relationships. Same kind of logic with the interventions. We have an outcome of our program and we want to understand more about that outcome. Why did it come out the way that it did? Each one of these, again, I mentioned it briefly earlier, are going to use the strengths of qualitative methods to understand how and why our results come out the way they do. Literally, if we did either one of these, we'd produce a statistical result and then say, okay, it's either significant or not significant. End of story. We had a hypothesis, we tested it, and P 0.05 or not, and what kind of discussion or conclusions would you have? Well, typically what we do is speculate about why the outcomes came out the way they did. Or statistically, we'll say P less than 0.05. Well, that actually technically means we rejected a null hypothesis. And I'm not going to go into great detail about that. Many of you remember it from surveys, but you may not remember it fondly. But the idea is you dismiss the hypothesis that it was due to chance. So you know that your results weren't random, but what did produce those results? Why did the survey relationships come out the way they did? How did the program operate to produce the results that it did? Well, we can really get in there with our qualitative research and look at what happened in much more depth and detail. So let's come down here on our variations, and we'll have two here, illustration and investigation. So let's take a look at the illustration. Shows how hypothesized outcomes operate in practice. Okay, so let's say I do a survey and I show the kind of hypothesized outcomes I predicted. How do I really indicate that I got those results due to the mechanisms that I theorized about? I had an idea in mind with those hypotheses, and I want to show that my prior theoretical basis for predicting the outcome was really substantiated by the participants when I talked to them about what was going on in relationship to the topics of the survey. In other words, I'm going to say follow up on the survey with some individual interviews, and we'll look at that probably under the examples, and talk to people. And I'm going to get good quotations so that I say, we saw this expected correlation. And as one of our participants expressed it, and then I'll give a quotation that shows why that relationship existed the way that it did. And so I'm going to be illustrating the processes that are operating underneath the survey or that are going on in the intervention. Now, the other side of this is, what if we don't get our hypothesized outcomes? What if we have unexpected results? Well, in that case, our explanatory design has a lot to explain, and we can come in with our survey and say, why didn't we get the results that we expected? In particular, let's suppose that you have really strong theory about why the results should be the way they are, and you used really well-designed methods to do your sample, collect your data in the survey, and the results don't come out the way that you expected. You don't get P less than 0.05. Okay, well, there's obviously something going on in the respondents' lives or minds that just did not match your theory or did not show up with your measures. And so rather than just giving up and saying, I didn't find what I thought I would, despite my strong theory, despite my excellent methods. Well, another logic of this whole design here is to say, well, why don't you ask them? Why don't you go out to the survey respondents and talk to them about what is going on here? Improve your theory, redesign your methods, but do that by using the kind of in-depth how and why understanding you can get from a follow-up qualitative design. The same thing goes with an intervention. Again, what if you have this super well designed intervention? You target exactly the kinds of factors that you think would produce the changes you want to have happen due to implementing your program, and you don't get good results. It doesn't show up statistically significant in terms of whatever you're trying to improve or prevent. Well, again, let's go out and talk to the participants and ask them, why the program didn't work as well as you expected it to. Will help to understand those unexpected results, possibly by doing some interviews again. We might, I'm going to show you an example now that in that case will involve a case study. All right. So let's look at the survey example, and I'll get more explicit here about how you could do this, the sort of specific design that the qualitative follow-up could follow here. All right. Let's suppose you're looking at a correlation that didn't prove to be significant. One of the classic reasons why, if you look at a scatter plot, is that there are outliers. There are people who really are pretty far from the regression line, if you understand that kind of statistical model, and they just have scores that are either much higher or much lower than you predicted. They don't fit the overall pattern in the scatter plot. Maybe the cases really do lie along the regression line, but there are enough cases that are far away that are these technical outliers. Let's find out what's going on with those people. What are, go back and re-interview them and figure out why they don't fit the predicted pattern. So this is an investigation type model. I think the illustration is pretty clear where you hear the stories of people to reinforce the understanding of your expected results. Here we're investigating why our correlation was non-significant. Let's talk to the people who are really disrupting the statistical basis for the correlation, the outlier. Okay, under interventions, well, what if you had like a dozen program sites, and even though the overall results were non-significant, when you look at it, there's some unusually low and some unusually high sites in terms of their ability to produce the outcome you were seeking. In other words, if you have a mean result, it's not going to be the same at every site that you implemented the program. And so we could follow up by doing some case studies on sites that were either well below the mean, whatever our program was, it didn't work that well at sites 1 and 2, let's say. And then we've got them in order. We could come out to sites 11 and 12 and say, wow, we had high success in those programs. What can we do to either fix the implementation of the underperforming programs, or what can we do to learn some lessons about why high-performing programs work that way and transfer those lessons into a redesign? Okay, so often with interventions, one of the things that happens is you get a good trend, you get a result that might be significant at p.10 or 0.15, but you can't really claim success. You don't want to just throw away all that effort. Instead, let's generate some hypotheses about what would make that program work, what changes would really take it to that next level of success, either by fixing the kinds of things that pull some programs below the level of the rest, or by learning some lessons from those that had particularly high success. Okay, so again, what we're doing is saying we've got a set of quantitative results. We want to investigate why those came out the way they did, how the results were really produced by the people who participated in the research, And that's what we're doing. We're explaining outcomes from the quantitative with our follow-up qualitative in this design. Okay, those are the two of the quantitatively driven designs. Let's look now at the other two, the qualitatively driven designs. So here are the sampling sequential designs where we have a quantitative input to our overall qualitative study. Okay, and what we're doing here is we're using the preliminary quantitative study to locate cases for a primary qualitative study. And the logic here is basically related to purposive sampling. And well, that's the main way that we put together the participants, who's going to be in the qualitative study. Okay, so in the survey case, not survey, excuse me, now we're shifting over to the qualitative methods. And our two qualitative methods are going to be interviews and case studies. So how can a quantitative input help us with doing either interviews or case studies? And this is where I say that we really need to do purposive sampling in qualitative research. That's also sometimes called purposeful instead of purposive. The two mean the same thing. But we have criteria that we need to meet. Who are our participants going to be? We can't talk to just anybody and everybody. Instead, we have selection criteria that define the purpose for our qualitative study. And then how do we find people who meet those purposes? Okay. What we try to avoid usually is what's known as convenience sampling. We just ask around and see if we can find anybody. Okay. A little better than that is snowball sampling, where we find a few people and then they ask us if we can find a few more. But you can see how that could be pretty limited. What we're doing with our quantitative input instead is to find some kind of a database and say, well, let's look for the kind of people who meet our criteria. Now, that's not always possible, but when it is, we can have a real systematic basis for locating our participants. We don't find our people by convenience or talking to their friends. Instead, we can systematically locate the kinds of people who meet our criteria that we want to interview. Now, remember, in a typical interview study, you're just not going to be talking to that many people. Maybe 20, maybe 12. It really helps to get the right people, the people who really do meet your criteria, who really do have the kinds of experiences and information you want to hear about. Sometimes when you're working about relatively rare populations or people who are hard to access by just asking around again, if you can find that quantitative database that will help you locate people, that can be really important in helping you match up the participants with your purposes. Now, the same thing goes with regard to case studies. In particular, if we think about the small n issues here, if we're going to interview 12 or 20 people, we might do one single site for our case study. Two, two is getting to be a lot. You're doubling the amount of work you need to do to understand the cases. So typically, case studies, we really have to find sites that meet our desired criteria. We want to, you don't want to go out to a place and invest a couple of months in studying it and discover it really wasn't what you expected and it really doesn't meet your purposes. That's going to be a tremendous waste of time. Instead, again, if we can find some quantitative data that would help us sift and sort the kinds of places we're looking for and really select a site that meets our purposes, that could be a tremendous kind of asset. And I'll just say, in terms of the strengths of quantitative data here, it isn't just that they list all of these possible cases or participants. They have comparable information about everyone. The kinds of standardization and comparability that are real strengths for quantitative methods can be tremendous value for the input into selecting our qualitative samples. We can say we need people who have characteristic A and B and don't have C. Okay, wow. That might be a lot to ask if you're going through talking to people. to locate people, locate participants. What if you've got a quantitative database to say, hey, I want A and I want B and not C? That's a pretty straightforward kind of question to ask. All right, let's look at some variations here, although we're going to get a different story than we saw under our previous two. So I'm going to say this is a pretty widely used design, but it's received relatively little attention in the research literature. The idea is that if you go out and look at how qualitative studies are done, and you look at the portions that are about sampling and locating the participants or choosing the case, it's often something there that says, oh, we looked at this prior survey, or we used this national registry, or we had good data available from the local council. Okay, and that's all that's said. In other words, it's a mixed method study that uses this design, but it doesn't say, well, we use the sampling sequential design. It doesn't call out the practice of using the quantitative database to draw the sample, even though that is what's often done. So one of the things I'm promoting and hoping that as I get the names of these designs well chosen, is that people will say, we use the sampling sequential mixed methods design, and that will make this a more prominent design. But at the moment, we're at a position where using that database that's driven by purposive sampling, wow, that's a pretty straightforward and important procedure, but it doesn't get mentioned or taken into account as much as it should be, I think, in these kinds of designs. All right, let's look at a couple of examples here. Uh, in the first one, what I want to do is create a small survey that can help me locate my potential participants. So I'm imagining a university where people do online courses, and I want to locate teachers who have either positive or negative experiences with online courses. Well, suppose I designed a very small survey and I use a database to see who's offered online courses. Certainly, my university keeps records of that. And then I maybe send out an email asking them, could they spend less than 5 minutes helping me out with a small survey about their experiences with online teaching? And I asked 5 or 6 questions about did they have positive or negative experiences. Then I want to do 20 interviews, 10 with people who had positive experiences, 10 with people who had negative experiences. My survey is definitely going to help me locate those people. And so you can think about, gee, how would you do that if you just had to find them or you wanted to find them? Again, you could easily be into an asking around kind of process, which is just I think not doesn't have the strengths of a systematically locating people who fall into either of your two comparative categories. So we have a purposive sampling. We want to find positive and negative experiences among people who did online courses, and a very small, low resource using inexpensive kind of survey could help us do that. Let's look at the case study example. Suppose I want to find a school where students who come from low income families perform much better than expected. So there's a well-known correlation in certainly Western research literature where the higher income families, schools with that typically serve higher income families, do better than low income families. We can literally again imagine a scatter plot and we'll see a rising regression line. The higher the income level for a school, the higher the academic performance. But wow, what if we look down at that place where we've got low income families and we have some outlier cases that are off the line where those schools are really outperforming the other low income family schools? Okay, I want to choose a school that really does, is really one of the outstanding schools, literally stands out. When I look at that pattern in the scatter plot, wow, there is one that's really spiking in its performance, is much better than I expected. I want to know what's going on there. And again, I'm going to find that school by looking at some quantitative databases. And these are the kinds of data that school systems typically do have. Okay, or we can match up the school districts with other data on income. And at least in the kinds of resources I'm used to, it would not be hard to get this picture of the relationship between the income levels in schools and the performance of the schools, and then go find that really interesting case where people who don't have a lot of resources, schools that teach students extremely well when we don't expect that. That's the kind of case we're looking at here. Okay, let's take a look at our last one. We're going to have an operationalizing sequential design where the quantitative follows up on the qualitative. And so in this case, you want to measure something about your primary qualitative study. You've got some outcomes and you want to say, all right, I want to use my interviews or the results from my interviews. I have 20 interviews. I want to show that the findings really have a much higher frequency than just 20 people. Case studies, I want to go beyond one or two sites to show that the kinds of lessons I've learned are really much more applicable than just the what I'm telling you about from case one or site two. Okay. Now, what's happening here is when I say operationalizing in interviews, we're taking the kinds of findings that we learned and creating a survey. To do a survey, we have to have questions, and the language is we operationalize our concepts, our hypotheses. We've generated a hypothesis from our interview study. Now I want to operationalize it into a set of survey questions. In the case study, I'm saying that I've found a really interesting pattern in the studies that I've done, the cases I've examined. I think that I can take that process and create it, I'm going to say in this case, turn it into intervention studies that would allow other places to benefit from the lessons I've learned. The case study has produced results, and I want to show those results can be applied in a wider set of settings than just the one or two I've observed. Variations, though, again, here we got a design that's seen relatively little use. And the last one under the qualitatively driven, I said it was widely used but not recognized. This one hasn't seen much application in either the interview side or the case study side. And part of that might be due to a confusion with validating qualitative findings, of saying that we have to prove them with quantitative methods. Here we're not trying to prove anything, we're trying to extend and add on in classic mixed methods fashion and say, how can we generate quantitative measures that test hypotheses that were generated by the primary qualitative study? This is a famous strength of qualitative methods to generate hypotheses. Well, then can we take that strength and in fact use a smaller follow-up study and indeed operationalize and do some preliminary testing of those hypotheses? Here are a couple of examples, and this is getting to the last slide now. With interviews, you convert what you learned from a set of focus groups into a series of survey questions. So one of my research areas that actually I used an example earlier is widowhood. We did a study where we published an article from a set of focus groups about the experiences of recent widows, and then we had some very interesting findings, and we were able to do a small survey, less than 50 people, to show that the kinds of things we had been hearing about in the focus groups could in fact be measured. And the results that we saw in that small survey showed the same pattern in the quantitative data that we'd observed in the qualitative data. So we generated hypotheses and then showed that those results were considerably more frequent than just in the qualitative data. And we gave other researchers a way of testing and examining that in their populations, their studies, by having generated questions that were easily transferable. Okay, in case studies, the classic thing that we're going to see is called a demonstration program. We're going to put together, probably at one site with a limited number of people, an intervention that implements what you learned from your case study site. So you're saying what I observed in that place can in fact be created as a deliverable program, and I'm going to demonstrate how that would work. And so this classic notion, if you're familiar with interventions and designing them, if you can do a demonstration to show that in a particular setting that you can implement the ideas that you have, then that's going to show that it isn't just a good idea that you got from observing that case. It's something that you can make it work by operationalizing the things that you observed into deliverable components of a demonstration program. So these are two examples about how we could be doing this operationalizing sequential design, how we could be doing this small qualitative follow-up. Okay, I want to give you guys plenty of time for questions. And so we've gone through these four designs and we've put them into context with other designs. And I'm ready to hear what you would like to know about it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, David. We do have our first question from Jane. One, is there anything inherent to a sequential study that makes the quantitative and qualitative elements stand alone, methodology, or produce standalone results? There could be some research questions that have both a quantitative and qualitative aspect without one being dominant.
Well, the problem is in a sequential design, um, one of them has to set the priorities for the other. So that's why I've called these sequential priorities. So if you're doing an input, that input has to meet the needs of the dominant method. Or if you're doing a follow up, again, you have to set out a set of questions, needs, goals, and then follow up on that. And so what you're talking about, I think, are what are known as equal priority designs, where the quantitative and qualitative are both large enough to be standalone studies. And that is common. It's by definition, you have to do it in a convergent study. If we go back to that initial flowchart, it's possible within a complementary coverage where you have equal kinds of needs, but it really messes up your sequencing if you're into those four designs. If you want each of them to take priority, well, how can you do that? Okay, and so it just works in some contexts, but not others. It's going to make your life a lot easier if you have priorities in your sequencing, because otherwise, let's say you do a full-scale qualitative study. Well, how do you know if that'll meet the needs of the full-scale quantitative study? And how do you know if the full-scale quantitative study will really match up with the full-scale qualitative study? That's very different than if you say, I'm going to design this small input qualitative study so that it very distinctly meets the kinds of goals and purposes that are associated with the large scale quantitative. To say that it's quantitatively driven or qualitatively driven, that makes it much easier to design. It makes it much easier to integrate. So I won't say that it's impossible to do equal priority sequential designs, but it is much harder to make them work because you don't have one driving the other and the integration is not nearly so obvious. Okay.
Okay. And we have a question from Chris. Let's say you have a qualitative study and there's an interest in getting quantitative results as well. This is what most textbooks define as the exploratory sequential design, but really this could be a QUAL to QUANT study. Is there a particular way to integrate the results? What kind of different questions should be asked for each method?
Yeah. Well, if you have qualitative results that you want to follow up with quantitative studies, that's what I would put into the fourth quadrant. Okay. In particular, what I'm hearing there is that the study is being driven by your qualitative results, and so that would be a small quantitative. And I think this is just something that where the field is at is that we've emphasized the exploratory, the explanatory, the quantitatively driven, and we haven't looked as carefully at the qualitatively driven, and we haven't, as I said, for each of those designs, the sampling is sort of done frequently but not widely recognized. The operationalizing is still a relatively rare design. So I would hear you saying that you want to say, I've got qualitative results. How do I get some corresponding quantitative data on the same topics? Well, you'd have to operationalize your interviews into surveys or your case study into a demonstration program. And, that's just something that hasn't been widely talked about. And, the more we publicize kinds of designs like that, the more you can say that you used a qualitatively driven approach, your goal was operationalization, you followed this particular kind of logic in doing it, and you'll have a good justification for doing that kind of study. And you won't have to say, yeah, I used an exploratory design, but I kind of flipped it around and made the quantitative the real driving force. And so it wasn't really the classic exploratory study. And let me talk about that. You don't have to get into all that if you have a well-known design that meets your purposes. So that's one of the goals I have here, is to say that there aren't just those two designs, there are four at least here. And I think the four are laid out in that logically in that table, and so it gives you some other options. My broad picture of how to do this is the more you know what your options are, the more you can, effectively design studies that use the kinds of methods that are available. So I'm trying to develop four options and not just two. Okay.
And the next question comes from Ohud Aldaran. Can more than one design be used in the same study?
Well, sequential designs definitely you have to design both the qualitative and the quantitative component. So if that's part of the question, then we're going to have a design like, say, focus groups to contribute to surveys. We need a design for the focus groups, a design for the surveys. And when we have that kind of exploratory sequential, the needs of the survey will drive the design of the focus groups. But another possibility that's going on there is to say, does it have to be just two methods in a sequential package? And we are seeing now more of what are called longitudinal studies that involve three-step sequential. So you might do a small qualitative as an exploratory input to the quantitative and follow that up with a small qualitative that would be explanatory. So that would combine the exploratory and the explanatory, small qual into large quant into small qual. So that's a possibility.
Okay, and the next question comes from Sana Al-Zahrani. Can you suggest any good references for the sampling sequential design?
Well, I do cover it in my book, the on integrating qualitative and quantitative. There's a whole chapter in there, and uh, there are several articles on sampling and mixed methods that I haven't looked at them in detail. If Yvette, what do we want to do about things like giving out my email address? I don't want to be inundated with requests, but I don't mind helping people out.
Well, the questions that are left here, I can email them to you if
Ah,
you'd like, and then we can post them on the
email,
website.
right. And email that one to me as well, and I'll look and see if I can find another reference. In general, if you can cite an extensive discussion in a book by a reasonably well-known author, then that gives you a pretty good justification. Okay.
Perfect. So we are out of time, but the questions that are remaining in the chat, I'll copy them and send them to David, and then the responses, I'll post them next to the recording of the session, so those of you that had questions, you'll be able to see them there. I want to thank you all very much for coming to this session. We will be having our next month will be Rachel Clark, using theoretical frameworks in mixed methods research. That's March 19th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. So the registration link is up on the website, so hopefully we'll see you all next month. David, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I just hope this has been useful in a practical sense. That certainly was my goal, was to lay out, like I say, some options that people could put into practice so that as you look at your research goals and purposes, do you find something that matches with the sorts of four possibilities I've laid out today. Okay.
Sounds good. All right, thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you next month. Bye.